So, welcome to today's episode of A Slice of Medieval. Today we're going to talk about one of my favourite medieval kings. He was quite the charmer, quite the superhero at war, and quite a divisive figure, mainly because of the way he died too early, if we can say that. So today we're going to chat, and I think it's going to be mainly me asking questions and Derek doing the answering, because he knows a lot more about the subject than I do. Edward IV, was he a hero or a villain? So, Derek, how did Edward IV come to the throne? And I was actually reading that we're recording this on the 4th of March, and apparently it is the anniversary today of Edward IV being proclaimed king in 1461. So, how did he come to the throne, and did he have a valid claim?
I'll take your word for it that this was the anniversary. I wasn't there, so I'm not sure. But Edward IV he's one of my favourite kings as well, as you will no doubt notice as we go through. He came to the throne in battle. He came to the throne by fighting battles and winning them. It's like everything else about, well, history generally, but the Wars of the Roses in particular, is that hindsight is something which colours everything we say about it. And it wasn't inevitable by any means that Edward would become king, either by fighting or in any other manner, because he was not the obvious choice.
No.
He was dealt a bit of a hospital pass by his father, really, because his father, Richard, Duke of York, had presented his claim to Parliament and said, well, I should be king, Henry VI shouldn't be. The Lords, in their infinite wisdom, decided that Henry VI would remain as king and that Richard, Duke of York, would succeed him, thereby disinheriting Henry VI's own son, Prince Edward. Well, as it turned out, none of that happened really, because apart from the fact that Richard, Duke of York, died or was killed, what it does do, this agreement by which Henry VI would carry on and Richard, Duke of York, would succeed, sowed the seed for Edward to become king when his father died, because obviously he then carried this claim to the throne. But the decision for Edward to actually go for the throne must have been on a bit of a knife edge, because his father and his favourite brother Edmund had been killed in the north. Edward was near Ludlow, and he was raising troops already to meet a Lancastrian threat from the west from Jasper Tudor. But he must have thought twice, I think, about what to do, because he was isolated in the west. There were no other Yorkist forces, and his main ally, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, was on the other side of the country in London.
And he was what, 18?
Edward was 18. Yeah, he was. I mean, he wasn't really that experienced either as a soldier.
No.
It's not as if he'd fought lots of battles with his father, but he was an excellent warrior. And as it turned out, he was a very successful general. But it was, as I say, it was very much a gamble from Edward's point of view, because the first thing he does is he goes into battle against Jasper Tudor. Now, that's at Mortimer's Cross near Ludlow, but that could have gone wrong at the start. He could have lost. He could have been killed, badly wounded, whatever.
Well, his men could have turned tail and run, because wasn't that the Parhelion battle where these three suns appear in the sky and everybody sees it as a bad omen, and Edward turns it around and says, no, it's the Holy Trinity, the Father, Son and Holy Ghost, and it says we're going to win.
Yeah. I mean, this is a good example of Edward. I mean, even so young, Edward was always looking for a positive solution. He was always
Yeah.
looking for a way forward, and he wasn't easily fazed by anything, as that shows. And so he turned it to his advantage. And I think because of his personality, his charisma, I think it's unlikely that his men would have lost confidence in him. Even though he was young,
Mm.
he had a way about him. He had a way about him which was attractive to both men and women. Men would follow him to their deaths. Women would follow him to their beds, or
Yeah.
his bed, as the case may be. So, I mean, he was a very attractive personality, but fighting a battle is not quite the same as being a ladies' man. So
Mm.
he was good with the guys. He was one of the lads as well, and they respected him as a man as well as a soldier.
Mm.
So even then, even winning the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, he then heads eastwards across to the Midlands. And you think, well, this is a really good start. But then he gets news that his major ally, the Earl of Warwick, the frequently much vaunted Earl of Warwick, has not only lost a major battle against Queen Margaret's army, the Lancastrian army, but has also lost possession of Henry VI.
Mm.
Now, the reason I'm mentioning that it's pretty significant because so far Edward has not claimed the throne. Up to this point, Edward is not claiming the throne. He is claiming to act for Henry VI. He's claiming that he's a loyal subject defending Henry VI's government against the Queen's forces.
Mm.
And he can do that because Warwick, his ally, holds the king. He has possession of the king, therefore he can say he's acting in the king's name.
Mm.
The moment Warwick loses possession of the king, everything changes. And when Warwick he takes the remains of his army across to the Midlands and meets up with Edward. At that moment, then there is a decision to be made, and it's a big decision. Do we disband our forces and run away and give up,
Mm.
or do we go make for London and try to seize the country? And if we do that, without the king, we are rebels, we are traitors.
Yep.
So what are we suggesting we do to get round that problem?
Mm.
And of course, the solution is for Edward to claim the throne and say, well, he should be king, so therefore he's acting quite reasonably, though of course everybody knows that he's not. Um, so that's how he decides that he has to take the throne, and that's what he proceeds to do. In March, he gets to London in March and raises more troops, rushes north, and takes on almost all the nobility who are fighting for Henry VI, takes them on at Towton in Yorkshire. Now, Towton is a very bloody battle.
Mm.
It goes on for a long time during the day. We're not even sure exactly the sequence of events. We're not even sure whether some events that used to be regarded as happening the day before are actually on the same day. It's very muddy water.
Yeah, the skirmish at Ferrybridge, wasn't
Yes,
it?
that's
It's
right.
either the day before or the morning of the Battle of Towton.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's very difficult to be absolutely certain. You'd think it would be certain which day something was on, but it's not.
Yeah.
So at the end of it all, although Edward does win the Battle of Towton, that again is on a knife edge all day, and it's very, very close
Mm.
indeed. The forces are very evenly matched, and the battle is really only turned at the end of the day when the Duke of Norfolk's forces arrive belatedly and swing things in Edward's favour. So he's got fresh troops coming in on a bitterly cold day when they've been slogging it out,
Mm.
hitting each other with axe and mace and sword all day. And he has fresh troops. And they give the Yorkists the impetus
Yeah.
to advance. And that advance quickly becomes a slaughter.
Mm.
and many more Lancastrian soldiers died than Yorkist. The conditions didn't help.
Isn't it still the bloodiest battle on English soil or
Well,
something
the
like that?
problem the
They think.
problem again is any estimate of numbers in the Middle Ages.
Mm,
You might as well just think of one, really, because the chroniclers who referred to numbers like 28,000 or whatever, they just plucked a number out of the air.
mm,
The only person who on either side who might have had a glimmer of accurate knowledge was a herald.
mm,
When they mustered the army, somebody would probably have had a rough idea of how many strong the army was. Very rarely did that information ever get to a chronicler, but I'm sure sometimes it did. The problem is we don't know
mm,
about the accuracy of that information. So I think what I always tend to say is I don't know whether it really is the bloodiest battle in terms of casualties, but it was certainly pretty bad, and it was certainly the bloodiest battle of the Wars of the Roses,
mm,
and probably the bloodiest battle on English soil in the Middle Ages. So it probably was, but the evidence is difficult to pin down, really.
mm. Yeah, I think certainly if they knew where all the grave sites were, because to bury 20,000 people, there must be a lot of mass graves up there somewhere. And I know they did find one.
Yeah, I don't think there's that. I
Mm,
don't think that many were killed, to be honest. I think it's too many. What I tend to do is this: they bandy these numbers about, and I'm thinking, well, there are only so many leaders and so many
mm,
captains. Are they all going to be
mm,
dead then? Because if that number have died, you'd think quite a few of the guys leading their men
yeah,
would have perished. There's no evidence that that actually happened. Yes, there were several key
mm,
deaths amongst the nobility who sort of went down with the
mm.
ship, as it were. But I'm struggling to think of anyone on the Yorkist side, any leader on the Yorkist side who was killed.
No, the only one I always remember is Lord Dacre,
Yes,
who was a Lancastrian, wasn't he?
yeah,
And the only reason I remember his name is there's an actual cross erected to his memory on Towton
yeah,
battlefield, and that's where you
yeah,
park.
yes,
And
yeah,
and he was buried with his
yes.
horse.
Interestingly.
So I've always got this impression of them digging a
Massive
massive
great
hole and
hole.
having him, yeah, and him buried while still sat on his horse
Yeah,
rather than just next
next
to
to
the
the
horse or
horse.
on top
It
of
would
the
have saved
horse. But
room, wouldn't
yeah.
it, if it was next to the horse? Yeah, so I mean, it was, I don't think, one thing is not in doubt, and that is that it was a very bloody battle.
Mm,
But the main, well, not the main, but a lot of the slaughter was at the end
yeah.
when the Lancastrian army was in full retreat, and it was almost impossible to retreat
Mm,
because of the nature of the terrain, the nearby river, and the fact there was only one bridge across it, which wasn't very big.
mm,
Yeah, and it was bitterly
mm,
cold, and really not a very pleasant day to be fighting.
yeah.
But there you go.
So that's how, I mean, he literally became king on more or less on the battlefield, but he did have a valid claim to the throne, although probably not. He would have been something like sixth in line to the throne if they looked at the proper line of succession.
Yeah, I think. Well, yeah,
But because
maybe
of,
higher than
yeah,
sixth, but
maybe,
I think
but
I think the problem is, without going into this particular point too much, all the descendants of Edward III had a
yeah,
claim to the throne. So there were some real duffers who had a claim to the throne as well. Fortunately, none of them became
mm,
king. But that whole dynastic issue is not an issue until the Act of Accord, where the agreement is that Richard, Duke of York, will replace Henry VI, which tends to suggest
mm,
that Richard, Duke of York's claim is a better one. But it's a bit of a fudge, really. I mean, but that's if you
mm,
look, if you wind things back a bit and say, without the Act of
mm,
Accord in 1460, Edward, Earl of March, would not have had a claim that anybody would recognise at the time. He would be, at best, a usurper, at worst, a traitor.
mm,
Whereas after the Act of Accord,
yeah,
there was a body of opinion that could say, well, he would be king anyway after Henry VI. So he's doing it early, as it were. But without the Act of Accord, that doesn't hold water at all.
Ah. So because the Act of Accord was never repealed,
Mm.
he was the legitimate heir to the throne.
Well, after Henry VI, but obviously he
Mm.
was taking the throne a little early, and I don't think anybody envisaged that was going to happen.
No.
Um, Again, I think when these sort of things are done, these sort of agreements like the Act of Accord, you've got to think about the real circumstances. Richard, Duke of York, had surprised everyone, including Warwick, by presenting himself as if he was king.
Mm.
They weren't ready for that. The Lords didn't understand what on earth was going on. What are you doing? Have you come to see the king? And he's kind of he's expecting, because that is the flaw in Richard, one of the flaws in Richard Duke of York's character. He's expecting to be, acclaimed as king.
Mm.
He's made this triumphal journey across from the west to London, and he's just sort of thinking, "Here I am, guys, crown me,"
Mm.
um, as if Henry VI's reign hasn't happened. And they don't know what to do. They're in an awkward position. Clearly, York has power.
Mm.
So what do? If they refuse, if they can't exile him, they haven't got the power to do it. So it's a very difficult situation. And I was including a bit of blame there myself when I said it was a bit of a fudge, but I can understand why they did what they did.
Mm.
Real politics
Mm.
obliged them to do something to try and keep the peace. Also, people would have said, okay, well, let's go with this compromise. Who knows what's going to happen in 6 months' time anyway? So, you know, Richard, Duke of York might die.
Yeah.
Who knows? And indeed, he did die. He had help. He had help.
Yeah, and he's only got, yeah, and they're probably thinking, and he's only got a 16, 17-year-old son at the time who probably won't actually, he's too young. Even at 18, most people who didn't know Edward would have considered
Yeah,
him too young
yeah.
to make his own bid for the throne. I mean, who'd support him? A child. He's practically a child, he's only on the cusp of manhood, no experience in warfare or government.
But he
Mm.
has been prominent for several years. Both he and Edmund, his brother, were very much in
Mm.
their father's and Warwick's councils in the previous 2 or 3 years. They'd not been kind of
Mm.
separate from that. They'd been part of the whole sort of Yorkist machine. So in that sense, I think when the mantle fell on Edward's shoulders, he was ready to accept
Mm.
it. He wasn't daunted by it. He wasn't shocked, except obviously very shocked that his father had been killed. I think in many respects he missed his brother more than his
Yeah.
father. They were very close. They were brought up together, and it was a big loss, I think, not only to Edward but later to the whole kingdom.
Mm.
He could have done with his brother Edmund around.
Yes. And also, I don't know how much that early grief at that age, because 17, 18 is still an age where you're forming your attitudes and opinions and things. And to have to shoulder that much grief at that age um, must have had an effect on him.
Well, the immediate effect was that when he won the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, he executed
Mm.
Owen Tudor, who was captured, and a number of other ringleaders. Now, Owen Tudor and all those other men were actually lawfully,
Yeah.
as far as they were concerned, fighting for the king. And obviously, Edward was also lawfully, as far as he was concerned, fighting for the king. So it's a
Mm.
bit of a grey area as to who was right and who was wrong. But I think, bearing in mind Edward's approach to executions later on, which was basically not to have them, I think that was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, a bit
Mm.
of a knee-jerk response to his own father's execution, or death rather, and maybe he was
Mm.
still hurting from that when he decided to immediately execute Owen Tudor, who was quite a respected figure.
Yeah, because after Wakefield, yes, Richard had been killed in battle, Edmund possibly in battle or in the rout afterwards.
We're not too sure, are we,
Salisbury,
really?
definitely, who was Edward's uncle, was executed at Pontefract,
Mm,
and all three
yeah,
were their heads were placed on spikes.
as if they're traitors.
Yeah,
Yeah,
in York.
yeah,
So
yeah.
he's got this image in his head, his dad's head on the spike and Salisbury's execution.
If I had to guess, I'd say that he felt Edmund's death more than the
Mm,
others. That I mean, Salisbury was more like, well, I suppose he
yeah.
knew him pretty well, but more of a distant figure. They
Mm.
were even his father was more of a distant figure than Edmund.
But the fact his brother had been killed and then his brother's
Yeah,
head
yeah.
stricken off and placed on a spike.
That would have been enough, probably.
Yeah.
And of course, he just won a battle. It, but it's not it's out of character for Edward
Mm,
later.
yeah.
It doesn't happen later very often at all, but we'll no doubt come to that.
But that maybe is because you have to later is not so much fighting battles all the time, is it? Whereas at this moment, it's one battle after another.
He fought quite a few battles. He ended up fighting quite a few.
So, what were his strengths?
We've covered a few. We've covered a few. I've mentioned his charisma and personality. I mentioned his ability as a soldier and a general. And you've got to think about this tall, strong man, youth, you could say, but he's a
Mm,
pretty full-grown youth in the finest armor you can imagine, goes into battle wielding a poleaxe in each hand and knocking the
mm,
living daylights out of his opponents. If you are a soldier in his army, you're really quite glad
mm.
he's there. You're thinking, yeah, I'm happy to go with this guy. I'll just follow
Yeah.
him. Uh, because he leads by
Mm,
example, and there's very little substitute for that in medieval
mm,
warfare. So he's got those things. Apart from that, as I said, that bout of executions after Mortimer's Cross, he's actually really
mm.
even-handed with rebels, with opponents. He's generous to a fault, really, with those who oppose him.
Yeah, I was going to say, isn't he seen as too generous in that he allows is it one of the Beauforts?
Henry, I think, Henry
He
Beaufort, I think,
yeah,
one of the
he pardons him, gives him gifts and things, and shares a bed with
shares
him.
a bed with him, but don't read anything into that, folks. Um,
No,
again,
that was just a sign that he
that
trusted him implicitly.
exactly, and it wasn't uncommon. Beds were
Mm,
expensive. Beds were a big thing in medieval times. So, the fact that he shared a bed with him didn't mean anything other than, as you say, that he trusted him. But historians can't have it both ways. Either you describe a
mm,
man as brutal because he eliminates all his enemies, or you describe him as weak because he doesn't. And I think Edward IV got the
mm,
balance pretty reasonably right. I, he gave
yeah.
Henry Beaufort a chance. He gave his brother, Duke of Clarence, a
Mm,
chance. He said, "Look, okay, you've opposed me, you've fought against me, but here's a lifeline." He did the same for Warwick, to be fair. Here's a lifeline. If I can trust
mm,
you from here on in, then we'll say no more about it. But it's not his fault that all of those men betrayed him again. That's not his fault. You could say he's naive,
mm,
but I don't think he is. I think he's quite sensible. And he reckons that a strong, converted Henry Beaufort on his side is worth quite a lot. And I think
mm.
he's right. But, he can't control these
No.
people. He can only do his best. And I think that was a reasonable gamble on his part. But again, it's a question
Mm,
of perspective. if you look at it from Warwick's point of view, or indeed most other people who fought for him at Towton, and he's forgiving one of their enemies, Henry Beaufort, they're saying, well, what are you doing?
Mm,
You know, this guy's the enemy. But I think Edward rose above those differences better than almost anyone
yeah.
else, because he's saying, look, yeah, okay, he was the enemy, but if we're to have any kind of stability,
Mm,
these people have got to be brought into the fold. If I
mm,
can't bring them into the fold, okay, I will execute them. I will get rid of them. But first job is to try and create unity. And I think Edward tried to do that all the time.
mm.
I think it's one of his major strengths. And I see that you can regard it as a weakness, but I don't think it is. Other strengths, his resilience is absolutely astronomical.
Mm.
The fact that he was able to lose the throne and then go into exile,
Yeah.
come back, and get the throne again against all odds is quite ridiculous. But there's a self-confidence there
Mm,
which is difficult to match in this period. I mean, Warwick had it. We'll talk about Warwick in a minute, but
mm.
yeah, I think he was determined, he was intelligent, he was resilient, and those were all strengths, and which helped him a lot.
So, speaking of Warwick, now we have covered Warwick in a previous episode.
Yeah,
So we're turning the tables on it. When we looked at Warwick in the previous episode, we were looking at Warwick. So now we're looking at Warwick from Edward's viewpoint. We know what Warwick wanted out of his relationship with Edward the Fourth, which was to be the power behind the throne.
yeah.
Um, Edward the Fourth didn't see his relationship with Warwick like that, did he? So is that why it went wrong? Because they both had conflicting visions of Warwick's role?
Well, I think everything I've said so far about Edward suggests that he was nobody's puppet.
Mm,
He was not someone who could be ruled by anyone else. Yes, he had his faults, and we'll talk about those, I'm sure, later. But as a person, he was not somebody who was easily railroaded by other people.
mm,
So Warwick presented this image to everyone, including other rulers on the continent, as the man behind Edward IV, the man who had made Edward IV, the man who would keep him in power, the man who would obviously benefit as well from his important position
mm,
as the leading nobleman under Edward IV. He he really saw him. think he probably saw himself somewhat in a father role, because obviously
mm,
he was much older than Edward. But Edward didn't see it that way. It's rather like the whole thing about Henry Beaufort. He's even-handed. He knows that if he raises Warwick up too far, and Warwick is already the most powerful nobleman,
mm,
so he's going to gain a lot from Edward's victory. But Edward needs to somehow temper that
mm,
by balancing factors. And Warwick comes to feel that Edward is blocking him at every turn. Edward feels that he's given Warwick an enormous amount of power and influence, and that the Earl should be satisfied with that, and
mm,
that to give him any more will be a danger, which is pretty much exactly what happens. He tries to
mm.
avoid that, but it's very difficult because Warwick is already very wealthy and very powerful.
Do you think they ever had an argument where Warwick said, I made you king, and Edward turned round and said, I won Mortimer's Cross and Towton. You lost
Yeah, I mean,
the battle you had to fight. I made
I
myself
mean,
king.
Warwick's nicknamed the Kingmaker. I think if anyone now in the 21st century believes that Warwick is a kingmaker, a kingmaker, they are deluding themselves. They are believing Warwick's propaganda. That's what Warwick told
Mm,
Europe. That's what Warwick told everybody, that he was the kingmaker. But the reality is
mm,
that, yes, his resources were very important to Edward. His presence was very
Mm.
important to Edward. But he wasn't Edward. He wasn't the man who sort of inspired the
Mm.
successful capturing of the throne. And yes, he was important, very important. And Edward rewarded him as a very important subject.
Mm.
But he didn't give him a way of becoming rather more than that.
Mm.
Principally, Warwick's problem was he had no sons. And the marriage, as is always the case in the 15th century or medieval period, noble marriages are really important for your future, your family's future. And the marriage market was not very good for Warwick's daughters. Warwick
Mm.
wanted one of Edward's brothers to marry one of his daughters, and Edward refused point blank.
Mm.
And that was a major issue. Warwick felt slighted and all these other things. But I think if you compare the two, I always think, well, Edward had self confidence, but no self importance. Warwick had self confidence,
Mm.
which was bolstered by his own feeling of self importance, that he was a very
Mm.
important man. I think Warwick's ambition got the better of him
Mm.
and destroyed Edward for a time.
Yeah. We get to this thing in 1464 where Warwick's trying to arrange Edward's marriage. And Edward stands up and says, actually, I'm already married. Uh, Awkward. But then again, he's still only a young man, so it's quite understandable in a way. Um, but I read David Baldwin's biography of Elizabeth Woodville a long time ago. And he made a point which I think is where I'm leaning to, because you've got this idea, you've got the two theories, haven't you? The Woodvilles were grasping, um, ambitious people. But Baldwin's theory was that in promoting Elizabeth to queen and marrying Elizabeth's family into the English nobility meant that he would have less reliance on Warwick and actually be creating a wider spread of power and influence by having all these families being connected to the king rather than just Warwick and the Nevilles saying, well, we're the closest family to the king other than the king's own family. Whereas now everybody can say it because they're all married to the king's wife's sister, brother or whatever.
I always find the whole marriage question quite amusing, really, because this is this is Edward is known at the time for his womanizing. I'm not at all convinced that marrying Elizabeth Woodville was a deliberate decision or even in any sense a political decision. I think it was a lustful decision.
Oh, definitely.
And it's quite possible, I think, that having married her to bed her,
Mm,
that he might have disowned the marriage later. I think
yeah.
it's quite possible that he might have done. But he doesn't. He decides to go with it. And what I find amusing is always that at these times at the beginning of a reign, everybody around him saying, for goodness sake, you've got to marry as soon as
Mm.
possible. When he does marry, they say, well, not her. Don't marry her. But it's a done deal. And
Mm.
I think there's a lot of truth in Baldwin's assessment of it. But I think,
Mm.
again, there's a little bit of hindsight there in that,
Oh yeah, I think it's not that he married her seeing that as an
yes,
opportunity. It's that he married her, realized what he'd got into, and then saw this opportunity to spread the influence and to use the Woodvilles to counteract Warwick.
yeah, the reason I'm hesitant about that whole argument is that it's the assumption of this entity called the Woodvilles. I don't believe it existed at all in any shape or form.
Mm.
What was the case was that her father, Richard Woodville, was, and her mother for that matter, Jaquetta, they were upwardly mobile people. They did want to improve their position and
Mm.
their connections, along with the rest of the nobility and gentry.
I was going to say, what was Warwick trying to do by marrying his daughter to Edward's brother?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think, there was an impetus there from her parents to put her in a position where she could
Mm.
perhaps catch the eye of the king. But this idea that there was a cluster of Woodvilles who
Mm.
influenced things, I think is very misleading. Certainly in the first reign, I think that kind of
Mm.
influence is non-existent politically. But what is there is this fact, this annoying thing to him in a way, is that he's got to find marriages for Elizabeth's sisters,
Yeah.
of which there are a lot. And if you're going to marry one of Elizabeth's sisters now that she's queen, you've got to be of a certain rank.
Mm.
And so it totally stuffs the marriage market because there aren't endless numbers of
Mm.
eligible bachelors. And this obviously goes back to Warwick's problem that probably the best catch, other than the king's brothers, that Warwick could get for one of his daughters is the Duke of Buckingham.
Mm.
He's the prime nobleman, apart from Warwick, certainly of the old nobility, and he gets married to one of the Woodville sisters, and that does put Warwick's nose out of joint because his argument, I guess, is that Edward won't let them marry one of his brothers, and now he won't one of them marry the next best
The
thing.
most eligible bachelor after his
But
brothers.
again,
Yeah.
if you're Edward, you're thinking, well, the Duke of Buckingham's got a claim to the throne.
Yeah.
Why would I want Warwick's daughters to marry into a claim to the throne?
Mm.
And he's consistent on that. And I think, why not? He's pretty sensible, really.
Mm.
So marrying one of his wife's sisters or relatives to noblemen is a good way of keeping them in the camp.
Mm.
Doesn't mean they won't rebel against you or turn against you, but it's a good way of keeping them on side for the time being.
Mm.
So yeah, I mean the marriage, it was a gamble from Edward's point of view to go through with it, but it did bring a large Woodville family, but it didn't bring a large Woodville political entity
Mm.
at any point. It brought some troublesome individuals. It brought, like any other family, it's got troublesome individuals, and it's got really, really effective, loyal individuals.
Yes.
Um, it's not, it's like branding any family. You can't say they're all the same. It's
Mm.
just ludicrous.
And it also did, I mean, just thinking, it did bring to light one of later medieval England's greatest jousters and polymath in Anthony Woodville,
Yeah.
didn't it? If his sister hadn't married Edward IV, would he have been so prominent and so respected throughout Europe?
No, I don't think he would.
Because he wouldn't have got the attention.
That's right.
So, there's things like that. You look at Edward IV, but because of who he associated with, it brings people out, you know, they might have the X factor, so to say, but if they don't actually get on the international
Yeah.
stage, it isn't seen.
Yeah. And I think the other thing to remember is that for that whole of that, what we might call the first reign, Edward didn't have a son.
Mm.
So for the whole of that period, the presumed heir to the throne, was his younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence.
Mm.
So the focus in those first 6 or 8 years was, from Edward's point of view, was trying to create a unified state, a unified kingdom, so that should anything happen to him, his brother George would
Mm.
have ample support around him.
Yeah, he probably didn't count on his brother George being one of the ones to actually
Yes.
challenge that.
Well, yes. That's another thing.
So it was, and I've been looking forward to saying this. It was a reign of two halves, 1461 to 1470 and 1471 to 1483. Was there a difference in his approach to government in the second half? And I suppose we have to say what happened between 1469 and 1471 in order to explain that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in case somebody doesn't know what the heck you've just said,
Mm,
it is unusual. It's unusual for a king to be deposed, but it's even more unusual for him to come back again. Yeah, so October 1470, Edward finds himself in exile.
mm,
And the first question is, how on earth did he manage to do that? He was looking quite strong. But essentially, he was betrayed by his brother, George, Duke of Clarence, and the Earl of Warwick. The Earl of Warwick plotted his downfall in 1469, but didn't manage to bring it about. And he plotted it again in 1470. So, yeah, I mean, I think you could say Edward was naive,
mm,
but executing Warwick at any point would have been a very major step to take
yes.
and might well have caused a reaction anyway. Warwick's brother, John Neville, powerful in the north of England. The north was always a hotbed of trouble. So if you're
Mm,
Edward, you don't really want to risk totally destabilizing the
yeah.
kingdom by taking out Warwick. Warwick had a lot of allies,
Mm,
a lot of people who depended upon him. So, that would have been a risky strategy, which is why even when Warwick had held him sort of under house arrest
mm.
for a while, he still didn't do anything against Warwick or his brother.
Well, I also have to say, and this doesn't get, I don't think this gets pointed out very much at all, but the idea of executing noblemen, even when they had betrayed the king, was a very new one.
Yes.
It wasn't something that Edward the First did it once, I think,
Mm,
although he was quite happy to execute Welsh princes and Scottish earls. English noblemen, not so
mm,
much. Edward the Second's reign, it was more his favourites who got executed rather than
mm,
Richard the Second seems to have turned the tables, where he executed, I think it was the Earl of Arundel, and then Henry the Fourth with the Epiphany Rising and the execution of
mm,
Edward the Fourth's grandfather. But it was only in the last 100 years that the idea of executing the nobility, rather than just confiscating their lands and making them spend a couple of years in purgatory before they were allowed to get their lands back, that had been the routine actions for centuries.
yeah.
And suddenly we're executing noblemen. So it wasn't something that was the traditional route to dealing with noblemen. With the common man, yeah, hang them, quite normal. But noblemen, it was a new attitude.
I think it stems from Henry VI's years in the 1450s or even before that, because in the past, you're talking about whether a king in full possession of his facts and everything else decided to execute a rebellious subject.
Mm,
Whereas in the 1450s, you're talking about rival groups gaining control of a weak king and persuading him that a certain course of action was a good idea.
mm,
So it starts in a way at St. Albans, the first battle of, well, so-called Battle of St. Albans. Everybody knows that that battle is really a series of assassinations rather than a battle.
yeah.
It's to take out people.
Mm,
That is its purpose, to take out people on the other side, in the other faction. And what happens to the Duke of York in the north in the end of 1460, what his death, Salisbury's death, Edmund of Rutland's death, those are also one side taking
mm,
out the opposition leadership. And this carries on
yeah.
throughout the period.
It's all a blood feud, really, isn't it? It's just one big blood feud.
Well, yeah, there is an element of that once,
Mm,
but only after St. Albans. But if you then put Edward the Fourth in the context of that,
mm,
he's resisting that. He's saying, let's try and find another way rather than just
mm,
hacking off somebody's head. So I think he's the exception to that. He tries to avoid
Yeah.
battle. He tries to avoid executions. It's not his fault if other people, through their ambition and greed, decide they want to go for it.
Mm.
So anyway, he loses his throne temporarily. He goes to Burgundy, which has been an ally of his, although I'm not sure the Duke of Burgundy was that pleased to see him.
No, he had to kick his heels for a while, didn't he? While Burgundy decided which side he was on.
Yeah, he thought, well, do I really
Yeah.
want an ex-king here? But he then manages to come back, and I won't go into the long story of how he comes back, but it is, let me say, typical of Edward that his energy, his optimism, and his personalities, his attraction means that he triumphs in the end. Notably, that he actually persuades the Duke of Clarence to come
Yes.
back into the fold. That's critical, absolutely critical. Clarence was a very powerful man. He held a lot of lands, he could call up a lot of men, and the switch of Clarence back to Edward changed the balance of power and enabled Edward really to. It was still pretty close, but he managed to defeat Warwick. So Warwick was killed, and then Margaret landed in the south, and at Tewkesbury, Edward IV won yet another battle and extinguished the Lancastrian heir, Prince Edward.
Now, Warwick had actually allied with Margaret and married his younger daughter Anne to Margaret's son Edward, Prince of Wales. And they'd agreed both to invade England. But do you think Margaret's delay in coming to England to waiting to see that Neville actually got control of the country properly before she brought Edward over actually hindered Warwick? If she'd come sooner, would Warwick's position have been stronger?
It's possible to argue it both ways. I think her delay was absolutely pivotal, but if you look at it from Warwick's point of view, yes, he wanted her to come, but he wanted to be able to present her with a fait accompli. Here you are, I've sorted everything, I'm victorious, I am the kingmaker.
Yeah, you owe me your crown.
Yet again, Warwick wasn't the kingmaker. Here I am again, a failed kingmaker, and now a dead one. But yeah, he would have, to start with, I don't think he was that bothered that she hadn't turned up, because he had plenty of allies he could call on. But because she hadn't turned up, when Warwick was defeated, it meant the Lancastrians were in a really weak position because they'd just lost a major battle at Barnet. They'd lost Warwick. They'd lost John Neville. They had lost some key figures in
and the custody of Henry VI
and
was
the
back in Edward
custody of Henry
IV's hands.
VI. Yeah, although by then it was less important because Edward was already calling himself king, so it wasn't such an important thing. But it certainly didn't help them that they couldn't parade Henry VI around. And I think Edward, he had a lot of luck, but then some people are lucky. Edward was lucky most of the time, and things fell out in his favor. But he also worked, he made himself lucky.
I think it was Napoleon who said a good soldier needs luck, but he also needs to be able to see when to take the advantage, when the luck's actually in his favor.
Yes. And I mean, a classic example of that is there was really an impasse at one point when Edward had come back to try and retake the throne. He got Clarence on his side, but was almost surrounded by Warwick's forces in the Midlands. They were sort of doing a bit of a dance around each other, but nobody wanted to really make a move. And Edward decided to race for London. He decided to race Warwick to London, and he won the race. As a result, he had all the resources of London at his disposal, and he could then come out in force to meet Warwick at a place which was more of his own choosing. Again, that luck, all of that could have gone badly wrong, but that's only with hindsight. What you can say is he made a big effort to get things right on that.
And also the fact that because Margaret's arrival was delayed, Warwick's army wasn't joined by Margaret's army. So Edward could dispose of Warwick's army first and then move to meet Margaret's army at Tewkesbury and fight them separately.
Yeah, I mean that is true, but some of her allies, notably Beaufort, he was
Right.
on Warwick's side. There were other allies there who were supporters, if you like, of Margaret, but they, like Margaret, were suspicious of Warwick. I mean, Margaret just didn't believe that Warwick would be able to deliver what he promised. She thought she couldn't trust him anyway, which is why she delayed, obviously. I think she was probably right not to trust Warwick, actually.
Yeah, but as a result, her cause was lost.
Bit of an unholy alliance, but yeah, it did divide the Lancastrian effort. I think you're right that had it not been divided, Edward's chances of success were much smaller.
But he did win. The Prince of Wales is killed on the battlefield or shortly afterwards.
Yeah,
Sorry, the Lancastrian Prince of Wales.
yeah,
And in the meantime, while he's been in Burgundy, he's actually heard that he has his own Prince of Wales, doesn't he? Also
yeah.
called Edward, just to
Yes,
help.
just to confuse things.
Elizabeth Woodville gave birth while her husband was in exile to their first son.
Yes, while she was in sanctuary, yes.
So now, 1471, Edward's back on the throne, rescues his wife from sanctuary at Westminster, and is presented with his son and heir. So he doesn't know how long he's got left on the throne, but he knows that he's got a son now. The Lancastrians are defeated. Henry VI is in the Tower of the London, though not for long. And the nearest Lancastrian heir is, everyone will say Henry Tudor. It's actually Margaret Beaufort,
Yes.
Henry Tudor's mother, who's the senior Lancastrian heir. So Edward must have felt that the war was over. Not that he actually probably knew that he'd been in a total war like we see it now. It was a series of conflicts back then, wasn't it? Rather than one umbrella war of the roses.
Yeah.
So did he change his attitude to government, or did he carry on the same way he'd done?
I don't think he changed his attitude as such. I think he was less trusting because he'd had some tricky moments with people he had trusted. I think it was still a difficult. People seem to think that it was a breeze after 1471. It was still a difficult political environment. His son had barely been born. He was far too young to rule, and therefore, yes, it was good from the point of view of the future. But for the present, it was likely if anything happened to Edward, his brother George, Duke of Clarence, would be regent. Because, if you look at the political landscape, George, Duke of Clarence and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, were now the senior peers. They were the bulwark of Edward's regime. The problem for Edward, and I think this is so often forgotten, is that those two brothers were at each other's throats. They were competing for the Warwick inheritance, this massive inheritance. Clarence had without Edward's consent, back in 69, had married Isabel Neville, Warwick's elder daughter. And so if you're George, Duke of Clarence, you think you should have the entire Warwick inheritance as well as the vast lands you've already got, because you're George, Duke of Clarence and you deserve everything. So he was very hostile to the idea that his brother Richard should marry Isabel's sister Anne. Because, there was the risk that his brother Richard would get his hands on some of this vast inheritance. So the two brothers were at loggerheads over that for some time. Well, I guess all three brothers were at loggerheads over it. Edward was tearing his hair out, probably, not quite sure how to resolve it. And when he did resolve it, it was all a bit grubby and, George was a constant worry because it's not just that George is unreliable. It's not just that George is ambitious, it's full of his own self-importance. It's that he's the one who'll have to take charge if anything happens to Edward. And people tend to forget that in the second reign. They think, oh, well, Edward's got a son, so it's a totally different situation. Well, it is different, but not totally, because the political situation is such. If Edward keels over and dies, George, Duke of Clarence, inevitably will control things. Probably not very well, but he will. That he'll be the one that it falls to.
Yeah.
So it's a very difficult situation. So what does Edward do? Well, he tries to build up other supporters, people who aren't attached to either of his brothers necessarily, people who aren't attached to the Neville family, as you mentioned earlier. So he tries to ensure that he has other men who will support him if it arises, or who will ensure that the Duke of Clarence is under control.
Because he has this awkward thing, doesn't he, where Clarence, because he's the oldest, he's the obvious one to take charge if anything happens to Edward, whereas Richard might have been the more capable younger brother. He couldn't actually put Richard in that position because George would just have attacked Richard anyway as soon as Edward was out of the way. So he had to find an alternative way to do it. The idea that George has got this attitude that he's the next in line, Edward must have felt a little bit worried about, for his son's sake, if George was the one who was going to be in charge when he died.
I think there was a genuine possibility of civil war if Edward had died in the 1470s, because I think Richard and George would have come to blows. They wouldn't have seen eye to eye at all. George would have wanted to exclude Richard, and Richard would not want to be excluded. So what Edward did was he built up Richard's power in the north at some expense, it has to be said. But what Edward also, and again, this is one of those things people tend to overlook, Edward had the opportunity to restore the Percy Earl of Northumberland, and he did. Even though he had been Edward's enemy until quite recently, he restored the Percy Earls to the earldom of Northumberland. So he was saying, right, you owe me for this. I could have left you in prison. I could have left you in the tower. I'm putting you back where you belong. You know, your job is to ensure my northern borders, along with my brother and along with Thomas Stanley, who was the largest magnate in the northwest. So if you look at the whole of the north, the most troublesome area historically for any king of England, he has got it covered as far as he's concerned. He's got his brother Richard, trusted brother. He's got Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, who owes his return to Edward. And he's got Thomas Stanley, who also owes his importance to Edward. So what he's done is he's tried to create powerful men in areas that might be difficult. And Clarence is one of those, because Clarence picks up a lot of land in the southwest. And he is the main man in the southwest, which was another area of trouble in 1470. So there's an element of sense to it. Interestingly, although the Duke of Buckingham is still around and very prominent and has enormous land holdings and a distant, well, not so distant claim to the throne, Edward very rarely brings him into the fold. He doesn't trust him, or he thinks he's incompetent. I'm not quite sure which. But one or the other is certainly true. Possibly both, I suppose. He's only involved on state occasions.
Yeah, he is a Lancastrian, though, isn't he? As far as his father was killed fighting for the Lancastrians.
Oh, yeah, but you could say the same of Henry Percy. He was definitely a Lancastrian in that sense. I don't think Edward would have seen him as a Lancastrian. I'm not sure anybody else would, for that matter. I think in a political age like that, you're really talking about, okay, where are the pieces I can move about to give me the best, most secure kingdom? And I mean, Buckingham's position in the West and the Welsh borders and so on was strong. But Edward himself, as king, had lands in the south, in the west as well. Perhaps he didn't need him. I don't know. But he certainly didn't involve him as much as you would expect one of the senior noblemen to be involved. It didn't happen. So, yeah, in that second half of the reign, he certainly worked hard to build up certain individuals in certain areas of the country. And of course, one of those, someone you mentioned earlier, was Anthony Woodville, who was Earl Rivers. And he gave him one of the most important positions by making him the governor of the Prince of Wales and establishing a household of Prince of Wales at Ludlow, with Anthony Woodville in charge of it, which gave that particular Woodville an influential position, which would later bring about his downfall. But not through his own faults, really.
No.
So it was a different sort of atmosphere in that reign. But apart from anything else, Henry VI was, well, died of melancholy or was killed, whichever idea you like to believe. But you've got a number of vacuums there. No Henry VI, don't need to worry about him. No Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, don't have to worry about him. No Earl of Warwick, don't have to worry about him. These are big figures. They're important figures or figures who would have been important if they were still there. They're all gone. So he's got a bit of a clean sheet of paper to work with, and he builds up those he thinks will help him.
Yeah.
Again, what we shouldn't forget is that he'd done this before the second reign. He'd done this by raising up the Earl of Devon, Humphrey Stafford, and the Herbert brothers on the Welsh borders, William Herbert. They had been raised up to prominence for exactly the same reason. What Warwick did when he rebelled was he just had them executed, as you do, you know. So it's not that Edward hadn't tried this before, it's that they came up against somebody who was a bit more powerful than them.
Yeah.
They were very unlucky in a sense, but he'd been in favour of building up these kind of pockets of strength. I think throughout. I don't think it's a change. I think that in the second reign there was more opportunity to do it because he had a freer hand.
One of the main charges against Edward IV, besides dying at the age of 40, which is always held against him, poor bloke, how dare you catch a chill and die when you did, is his treatment of George, Duke of Clarence, his oldest surviving brother, and the fact that he executed him. I personally don't think Edward had much of a choice, because George seems to have been one of those people who he's typical middle child. I'm saying that as a middle child myself. He just pushed the boundaries and was rather unpredictable. Do you think?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Predictable yet unpredictable. I mean, he was predictable insofar as, I mean, I think Edward had a pretty shrewd idea what George was likely to do, given enough rope. I mentioned earlier that I thought the loss of Edmund, his other brother, was a serious loss for the country, because I think if you have four brothers, if you've got Edward and the next in line is Edmund, who there's every reason to believe would have been both very loyal to his brother and very capable, though we can't be sure about that, but certainly would have been loyal. George, Duke of Clarence, doesn't have that pivotal role. And so the political landscape would have been vastly different. But in the 1470s, he does have that pivotal role. And this is an embittered man. Let's be clear. George, Duke of Clarence, is already an embittered man. And don't forget that Warwick was going to make him king.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. Wasn't Warwick going to make him king at one stage and then change his mind?
Warwick was going to make him king. So if you think about it, let's start there. George is willing to trash his older brother to be king. He's willing to rebel, to betray his older brother because he's got the offer of being king. Why does he go back to his brother? Because Warwick has made an agreement with Margaret of Anjou that her son, that Henry VI's son, will become king after Henry VI. Well, where does Clarence fit into that? Answer, he doesn't. So one powerful reason for Clarence going back to Edward IV is that he's got far more chance of power and influence than he has under a new Henry VI regime, with Margaret of Anjou back and their son and so on. So then we have the struggle for the Warwick inheritance, where he is his usual self, his usual selfish, self-absorbed self, and he gets away with all that. He behaves badly, but he gets away with it because he's the king's brother, and he's given a lot of leeway, probably too much. But he is very powerful, and he pushes Edward as if you're prodding somebody. He pushes him and pushes him and pushes him by, raising his own profile, by questioning the king, by questioning the king's decisions, by interfering in law cases to support his own people. He's a bit paranoid, I think, as well. As an individual, I'm sure there's a lot of material there to be psychoanalyzed.
Yeah, I mean, certainly with the death of his wife, the paranoia shines through. She dies in childbirth, but as far as he's concerned, she's been murdered by poison.
Yeah. And he pursues the person he decided poisoned her, doesn't he?
And has her executed.
Has her executed.
Is it Agnes Turwit?
I can't remember her name. You could be right.
I think it's.
But
yeah.
But he's vindictive. And if you compare him with his older brother, and I think to an extent with Gloucester, Clarence is the really vindictive one.
Mm,
If he thinks you've done him down, you are in big trouble
yeah.
because he's coming for you no matter what, even at his own expense,
Mm.
which is what happens in the end. He just pushes and pushes and pushes.
Well, that's the thing. He seems to think he's immune because he's the king's brother.
Yes.
It's not going to come back on him. He can do what he wants because at the end of the day, he can turn around to Edward and say, I'm your brother.
Well, not only that, I think he can also turn round to him and perhaps say what Warwick might have said. I made you king again.
Mm,
Without me, you'd have lost.
yeah.
But Edward was never much convinced by such arguments anyway. And I think he just got to the end of the road and decided, look, he's got to go. And of course,
Mm,
Shakespeare manages to blame Richard for that. Let's be honest, I can't see any reason why Richard would be shedding an awful lot of tears
mm,
when Clarence is executed, because it opens up more possibilities for him in so many ways.
yeah.
But I don't think he brings it about. I think that
No.
is down to Edward. Edward decides he's had enough, and that
Mm,
George's presence, rather than being a strength, is now a weakness.
mm,
It's destabilizing politics, and he can't have that. So, unusually for Edward, he executes someone in that reign, and unusually, he executes a brother.
mm.
So, I think George is someone who's responsible for his own downfall.
Yeah, definitely. I think Edward had no choice in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think if he'd kept him locked up, I
Mm,
think he would have been a constant thorn anyway. He would have been a problem. And it is always, it comes up a lot in history that do you execute someone who could be a potential problem, or do you let them live out their natural life?
mm,
It's easy after the event to say, oh, well, he shouldn't have done that or he shouldn't have done that. But it's an individual weighing up a personal and political decision. And Edward decides he has to go. And
mm.
I agree with you. I think there's not much else he could have done, really.
So I'm hesitant to ask this because I think we may end up on Richard III, which could cause problems. But some people love Edward IV and some hate him. What makes him so divisive? Or is that something that's happened more recently than, I've always seen him as a bit of a hero, but he gets blamed for dying too soon. It's his fault that things in 1483 went bad because he should have stayed alive for another 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, oddly enough, I don't blame Richard III particularly. If you believe the Tudor myth, then Henry Tudor is the architect of success. He's the one who brings unity to the kingdom after years of turmoil, blah, blah, blah. I don't believe that, but the Victorian historians did.
Those nasty Victorians, I knew they'd get in here somewhere.
I blame the
I
Victorians
always do.
because exactly. If you can't think of anybody
Blame
else,
the
blame the
Victorians.
Victorians. But basically, they saw Edward IV as licentious, a
Yeah.
glutton, a waste of space, made bad decisions, married the wrong woman,
Mm,
and generally was a complete loser who died, as you say, too soon.
mm,
So they didn't rate him either as an individual or as a king. And that traditional view, as you might say, of Edward IV persisted for decades and decades into the 20th century and beyond. And it was only relatively recently, in the second half of the 20th century, that you begin to see someone like Charles Ross, for
mm,
example, in his fabulous book, Edward IV, begin to look at Edward IV in terms of what he actually did as king, apart from what he did as an individual,
mm,
and without the benefit of hindsight rather than, comparing him with Henry Tudor. So for me, I think all of this, the negative side about Edward IV, is born out of that traditional view that Edward IV couldn't have been very good because he wasn't Henry Tudor. He wasn't the one who succeeded.
mm.
Henry Tudor was the last man standing,
Yes.
really, and that's his claim to fame. Edward IV, had he died 2 years later, perhaps even less, his legacy would have been seen as a powerful one, as a strong one.
Mm,
But because he died a little too soon for his elder son to rule, it led to uncertainty, and the uncertainty led to Richard III and so on.
mm,
I think though Richard did attempt not so much to blacken his brother's name, but to sort of sow some seeds which suggested that Edward had done things wrong.
mm,
Although he did that, I kind of understand why Richard did it.
mm,
Um, and Richard was fiercely loyal to Edward throughout Edward's lifetime. And I don't think we should forget that entirely. I think, the damage to Edward IV was done long after that period.
Yes.
It was done much later by the historians of the 19th and early 20th centuries, who persisted in the view that because Henry Tudor was a success, Edward IV couldn't have been. Despite the fact that, as later historians said in the 20th century, basically Henry Tudor did what Edward IV did, only he did it a bit better and for a bit longer. So, I think his reputation as a divisive figure is very false. He ruled pretty well for most of the time. He was poorly served by some of his noblemen in their disloyalty and so on. And he died quite young, really. He died, unfortunately, too young. I think Charles Ross says he went fishing, caught a cold and died.
Yeah.
If it's not him, it's somebody else. But yeah, it seems to be the most important thing. I think you alluded to that earlier. It seems to be the most important thing about him is that he died. Well, they all died. He made a pretty good effort to leave a stable succession.
Yes.
That's the point. It's not as if he ignored it.
And when you think about what he did at a very young age, he was only 40 when he died.
Yeah.
He'd been on the throne for 22 years.
Yeah.
Practically almost to the month.
Yeah.
And yet he'd literally grown up on the throne, you look at 18-year-olds today. I mean, my son's 19 and I look at him and think, could you fight two battles within a couple of months of each other, win both and get yourself crowned?
It's a little unfair on your son since he's not been trained from an early age to fight, but yeah.
Well,
I always think, well, what did people do? Judge them on what they did, not what somebody thought of them. And what he did was pretty good, I think.
Yeah.
And certainly, even putting his son in the care of Anthony Woodville, an educated man, a soldier, a politician, but a man with a brain, a man with a conscience.
Yes.
So he gave his son the best possible environment in which to flourish. Again, he didn't just leave him to do whatever and to find his own way.
No.
He did his very best. So any claims that Edward was not a very capable king, I'm afraid I would dismiss out of hand. But, he died. Yeah, we all die. So
I think history has definitely done Edward IV a disservice. So the big decision, we said in the introduction, the whole point of this episode was Edward IV, hero or villain. I've always loved him. I've always thought of him as one of the more interesting kings. So to me, he's a hero.
Well, I don't think it would surprise anyone to know that I quite like Edward IV. I admire Edward IV in many ways, not in every respect, but I don't like really labels. I've just written an entire book where I've tried not to label anybody and tried to destroy any labels that might already have been awarded to them, because labels are rarely accurate. So, I mean, nobody is either a hero or a villain, really. But the balance, I agree with you, the balance is for me that Edward did a lot of things right. And even when he made mistakes, it was rarely through avarice. It was rarely through peevishness. He made mistakes, but they weren't mistakes through necessarily unkindness to others. They were just mistakes. They were just miscalculations. Trusting too much at times, yes. But does that make him a villain? I don't think so.
No, I think there's that idea, isn't there, that somebody's gullible. It's not being gullible to trust people. The person who abuses that trust is the one in the wrong.
Yeah, I mean,
not the one who does the trusting.
The one thing Edward was never was gullible. He was not. People say, well, when Warwick in 1469 basically rebelled against him or orchestrated a rebellion against him with Clarence, why didn't he slap the man down? Why didn't he punish him? Why didn't he get rid of him then? Save himself a lot of trouble. And he would have done. He would have saved himself losing the throne, probably. But that's not how Edward ruled. He had to keep powerful men on side. And often when people talk about this period, they seem to ignore the fact that someone like Warwick, someone like Clarence, they can call on massive resources. So you oppose them at your peril. If you're a king. You want to keep as many of those people on side as possible. So Edward lived in hope, which, as it turned out, was true, that he could turn his brother back into the fold. He lived in hope that either Warwick wouldn't live forever or he would change his mind and he would try to work with Edward if he saw there was no alternative. Don't forget, there wasn't really an alternative until Warwick made that somewhat giant leap and made an agreement with his arch enemy, Margaret of Anjou. I mean, nobody predicted that.
Well, even Warwick wouldn't be able to predict that, would he? Because they were literally mortal enemies. They hated each other.
Yeah.
I mean, it shows how much by when he went to her and submitted to her, she kept him on his knees for
quarter of an hour.
Rather as it should have been about a minute.
Yeah, I think this is it. Anyone who says, well, he should have dealt with Warwick doesn't understand the 15th century politics. What was Warwick to do next? He'd failed.
Yeah.
He was a beaten man. He was actually in exile after that. And it was a lost cause. His career was over. He was finished.
Yeah.
Only with the aid of Louis XI, the Spider, Universal Spider, did he reach this agreement with Margaret of Anjou. None of the people involved would have predicted that that could have happened.
No.
So as far as Edward was concerned, Warwick was a spent force. His brother could probably be wooed back into the family fold and all would be well. And I don't think that's being at all gullible.
No.
It's been pretty sensible, really. So whatever you look at, I mean, I'm trying not to be an apologist for Edward IV in every respect, because he did trust people too much sometimes. But I think whatever you look at, he tried to rule sensibly. Yes, of course, he wanted his own importance to grow, but I think he did a lot for the kingdom in terms of its trade and wealth and its stability. He's not perfect, no king was perfect.
Nope.
But I think he did a fair job and was poised to pass on the kingdom. At least he died in his bed.
Yeah, that was...
He could pass on the kingdom to his son in the confidence that his son would have several uncles who would help him.
Yeah, and he passed on a kingdom that was stronger and richer than the one he'd inherited in 1461 and more unified.
Yeah. And he wasn't at war with France.
Yeah, he wasn't at war with France and he wasn't at war in his own kingdom.
Well, he did go to war with France, but only briefly.
Yeah, and we got France to pay him to not go to war with France.
Yes.
So, yeah, all in all, he left England in a stronger position than the one he'd inherited.
Absolutely, definitely.
Which is a sign of a successful king.
You'd think so. He's had to fight against the bad press.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for listening to our investigation into Edward IV and whether he was a hero or villain. Let us know what you think. Use the comments below and say whether or not you think you agree. Do join us next time when we have a guest, Tom Andrews, who will be talking with us about medieval policing. Tom's a lecturer in police history, mainly from the 19th and 20th centuries, but he's going to talk to us about how policing developed in medieval times. Thank you very much for joining us. I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Thanks for listening. And do subscribe to avoid missing a podcast. If you enjoyed it, perhaps give it a like. We'd love to have a rating or a review from you. Join us next time.